welcome to Classics Confidential on location in New York. I'm talking with Shearin from the University of Miami, who has presented a paper on the conversation between Plutarch and Aristophanes. So tell us about your work in this area, Will.
Sure. Well, it comes out of a paper that I'm writing for Brill's companion to the Reception of Aristophanes, and which is edited by a friend and colleague, Phil Walsh. And what I wanted to say is that it's sort of, it's potentially, it's not the introduction to the volume, but it's sort of the beginning of the volume, as it were. And it comes out of this idea that reception is something, not that, we only do reception in the 20th century or the 19th century or, the 18th century or what have you, but that reception is something that's already with us in antiquity, right? And so, in looking at Plutarch, who I think for earlier generations is just a later ancient figure, and looking at him through the lens of reception, I think it provides a different way of understanding what he's doing, right? And I think that, the key notion there is that reception is a way of thinking about the world, right? It's a way of approaching the world. It's a way of reading texts rather than being, something that's just, it's only done a certain time period. And so I think that's one of the key notions that motivates that research, and also some other things I've done. And so I think one of the key ideas behind that, one point that's often made, but I think it's true and worth making again, is that reception, in looking at the many different versions, many different readings we have in different time periods of different authors, so in this instance Aristophanes, it tends to help us, I think, destabilize any sort of singular notion of, oh, this is Aristophanes, this is what he really meant, this is what was going on in the 5th century, this is the one, and I think in some ways traditional philology works towards that model, right? We're trying to do this research and figure out, oh, what did he really mean to say there, or what was really going on in that original performance, and that sort of thing. And so I think the focus of traditional classics often does have this idea that there is a singular model, single interpretation. And so I think getting reception work, which often has been done in later periods, back into antiquity itself helps provide us with a different lens, right? This kind of destabilized lens for what it is that we're doing. And so that's one of the things that spurs my interest, not just in this project, but in bringing reception terminology to certain ancient texts, right? And so it's kind of a, for me again, I think it's a methodological principle. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely, and I mean it's important to remember that in the case of Greek tragedy, the tragedians were already receiving mythology, epic, lyric.
Right.
So reception really does begin in antiquity and was seen as an integral part of what these playwrights were doing. So,
right. So there's this intense sense of reworking, right? This sense, right, and that's definitely what they're doing. I mean, I think in many instances we know for certain that the plots of many of the tragedies, etc., are not original, right? I mean, in Aristophanes, it's sort of a different circumstance, right? I think these are original, yes. Right? That's what we generally think. But that said, I do think that in some instance, the idea of reperformance is already there, because a lot of Aristophanes works off of parody citation, particularly with the tragedians, right? And so it is this kind of reworking of some other text somewhere, right? And that's again, so you're getting a new version, a new and different.
Yeah. So I mean, it is about conversation of texts, in the plural,
right?
Really. So that's what's so exciting.
Yeah.
Talking about Plutarch, or returning to Plutarch,
right.
He of course had an impact in the way that later generations thought about Aristophanes.
Right.
Can you tell us why it was so negative?
Sure. No, so this is interesting, right? And this is one of the reasons why I got interested in this specific moment. I mean, it is one thing, in talking with friends who are reception specialists, I think it's often emphasized, well, you can do reception anywhere with anything, but it's most interesting and most significant in those moments where, I mean, whether because of the politics or whether because of the specific influence of the person, you know, there's something kind of impactful about that given reception, right? And that's why you want to look into things. And as you say, with Plutarch, this is a moment, it's actually, so the primary piece of critical writing we have from Plutarch on Aristophanes is this comparison between Aristophanes and Menander, right? So basically old comedy and new comedy, right? And as you were just suggesting, it had a long shadow, right? It has a long shadow, and it was incredibly, at least when one views the opinions expressed about Aristophanes, it's incredibly vitriolic, right? It's incredibly vitriolic, it's incredibly venomous, and I was really prompted, you know, for the piece I'm writing, I was prompted to ask why. You know, why is he so offended? I mean, because there are lots of things we see, I think, at many different moments in the reception history of Aristophanes where, you know, okay, there's rampant sexuality, there's obscenity, there are all these different things that might offend our sensibilities, you know, our Victorian sensibilities or something like that.
Which is why they were sort of marginalised and, you know, kept hidden.
Exactly, marginalised, kept hidden at various times, but in fact this doesn't really seem to be what Plutarch is so angry about. And that's kind of strange, right? He's not angry about the dirty language, he's not angry about the sex, he's angry about, I mean, again, I like to view it in, it is about language, right? But it's about kind of linguistic order and structure, right? I mean, first and foremost, it's a critique grounded in this idea that Aristophanes does not represent a social order, but then you might say a cosmic and world order that is one that Plutarch himself assents to, right? And so again, it's this sense that Aristophanes' language, it's a bit too jumbled up. It's a bit too chaotic. It gives us too many different views, right? And you know, I mean, when I was writing the paper, I like this. I don't know if you know the American poet Wallace Stevens, but Wallace Stevens has this line from "Is the man who plays the blue guitar," and he says, you know, he does not play things as they are, right? And this is how Plutarch. I mean, I think Plutarch's ire, right? His anger against Aristophanes really is that Aristophanes is not playing things as they are. Of course, that's as they are for Plutarch, right? For Plutarch. In fact, I think many of us would say that Aristophanes' world, I mean, even if it's comic and fantastic, in some ways, I think part of his power and part of his survival is connected to the fact that he does get at something that's really genuinely Athenian and from the 5th century capital of Athens that we don't, you know, we don't get in other ways, and that is, so there is a way in which I think he's more realistic, right? There is a kind of verism there, but it's just his reality is not Plutarch's reality. And so again, I mean, what I do in the paper is to try and connect some of this criticism to some of Plutarch's educational theory and philosophy more generally, to show exactly how that works out, how it plays out, that, you know, what he's upset about is, again, this representation of reality, which is just not his own, and one that I think in some ways undermines his own moral educational theory, his own sort of structure of the world, even potentially his whole metaphysics, Platonic metaphysics, these kinds of things. And so I think it is, you know, it's Aristophanes is a bit too muddled, a bit too mixed up, a bit too kind of free, as it were, and this is not okay for Plutarch. Yeah, it's not good. But as you say, I mean, for a long period, I mean, almost all the way down to modernity, Plutarch's shadow has really, it's carried this significant influence, and so it is. But I think it's also interesting, as I was stressing before, that this comes not out of the kinds of things that we would think would be censored today. Again, I mean, I think there is a moral and educational component to it, but it's more really, again, I think fundamentally about a representation of reality than it is about the fact that, you know, again, there's certain words or certain gestures or certain things or certain topics that are taboo or something like that. And I do also think that a lot of the ancient reception, and this is one of the interesting things about the Second Sophistic period more generally, not just, say, Plutarch with Aristophanes, a lot of the ancient reception of classical texts has to do very much with language and with pedagogy, right? Which is to say, so I think one of the significant things about Aristophanes in his ancient reception is that he's a source of Attic language, and he's a source for teaching Attic language.
So he's a pedagogical tool.
Exactly, he's a pedagogical tool, and obviously he's still taught in universities now. I mean, for us, he's a different sort of pedagogical tool, but I think for a long time he was viewed again as this source of pure Attic diction, Even though actually he does, I mean, if you read the plays, he does Doric, he does, I mean, he does lots of different types of things, right? So it's not...
Invents his own words.
Right, invents his own words, right? So you know, that tradition of representing him as just as a pure Atticist, I mean, one might ask, you know, why do we always say that, and why don't we talk about the other dialects and, right, the neologisms and all these other sorts of things? But nonetheless, it is, I think it colors the way in which Aristophanes is read by Plutarch and others in this period, but also the fact that he survived at all, right? Because we might think, I mean, certainly for you know, some of the other authors I work on, sometimes, for example, Epicurus. Epicurus was largely destroyed because, oh, he's a materialistic heathen, right? And this was
not a good role model.
Not a good role model at all. I mean, he believes that pleasure is the goal. You know, hedonism, these are bad things, right? And Aristophanes, you might think it's the same situation, right? Because it's, you know, it's sexuality, it's obscenity, etc. But because of his language, because of the sort of perceived purity of his Attic language, we have to keep him. Right? Yeah. We need him around for teaching that purpose. Right? So I think that's you know, it's an interesting moment. The reception specifically with Plutarch, but then more generally the kind of second sophistic reception of Aristophanes. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Will. It's very interesting.